All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's film program, which is Labor on Film. A little bit of background. I was planning on doing this topic last September. I kind of figured in honor of Labor Day. And then over the summer, the double header of the WGA strike and the SAG strike hit, and that's what gave us the History of Hollywood Strikes program. But I figured I'm like, okay, I'm gonna come back to this eventually. So here we are for Labor on Film. So why are we talking about this and what are we going to discuss? So I think the older I've gotten, and this kind of coincides with me being a little bit more conscientious about work and labor and how that relates to just everyday life, and also also coinciding with the way I watch film as well. So when I was younger, I definitely saw film more as entertainment. The older I've gotten, the more I see it as, depending on what you're watching, a reflection of your life as well. So the idea of work on film has fascinated me because I've started to kind of notice like only certain jobs really get portrayed, or there's such a thing as movie jobs. What isn't Todd? What is it? Architect is usually like the number one movie job, or you work in advertising or something in just the tech world. These
Yep.
jobs, yeah, these jobs that usually put you in a big city, they have a good salary so you can make a ton of money and live in a nice lavish apartment without anyone asking questions. And it kind of has that thing of like, oh, you don't have to be in the office, or you can like work different hours. um those are the jobs that you see in a lot of like rom-coms and stuff, or they are there to basically say, well, this character has a job. In some cases, it's there to facilitate conversations with other coworkers. It might be there to have the romance. But there are a lot of movies, at least movies in Hollywood, they don't really focus on work, or should I say, like the regular everyday labor that people like you and I do. There are very few films that feature librarians. I mean, there is The Desk Set and Foul Play with Goldie Hawn and Chevy Chase. And of course, Evie in The Mummy, but I'm pretty sure that is not a very accurate depiction of a librarian's job. I wish it was. Or Todd, like, when's the last time you've seen a medical biller in a movie?
You mean a role that wasn't just a passing reflection on the ultimately broken system and medical system? Nada.
Oh. Yeah, you don't really see that much. So what the films I'm going to discuss today and the jobs that I'm going to discuss are in many cases jobs that get overlooked in a lot of mainstream Hollywood movies. So some of these movies will be mainstream. A lot of these films are going to be independent features. There are going to be a few bigger movies in here that I chose. One because it is actually lauded by a lot of people in the profession as a very good depiction of their work. But a lot of this is going to be stuff um that is ignored in Hollywood, and in many cases these are the jobs we kind of ignore in everyday life because we see it, but it's such a part of our life we never really think about who's doing these jobs. And they kind of say here, like, the jobs we get in a lot of mainstream movies, we have doctors, we have lawyers, we have soldiers, or there's a lot of actors. But again, those are jobs that have almost built-in drama. If you're a soldier fighting at war, there's built-in drama. Or how many courtroom dramas have we had in film? And that's not to say that they're bad. There are great films about soldiers. There are great courtroom dramas. I just watched, not just, but I would not have seen The Verdict had I not heard it recommended on the podcast, because I kind of dismissed it as like, another courtroom movie, whatever. But yeah, that can be great. But if you were, let's say, an alien who started watching Hollywood movies, you would think that the only jobs people had were like those five jobs. You don't see the janitor as the lead in a Hollywood movie that often. So the first job and the first movies we're going to be discuss are going to be that of the world's oldest profession. So, and I called it, we're going to talk about two films, Working Girls, which is a 1986 film directed by Lizzie Borden, a great movie if you can watch it. I believe it might be on HBO Max on account of it's part of the Criterion Collection, or if you would like to place an order, Criterion has it on Blu-ray and DVD. And the more recent film, 2020 film Zola. And I put here the portrayal beyond the Fantine archetype because in a lot of film, people who work in sex work, they again, I kind of use the Fontaine thing. They're forced into it either by violent force or by economic means as a last resort. It is not something they want to do. And yes, that is a reality for many people who are in sex work. Sex trafficking is very unfortunately a thing. And there are a lot of people who are like, okay, well, I have no other options. I guess I'm going to do this. But there are also people who willingly work in sex work. And I have been always been a very, well, not always, but past, I'd say 10 years or so, gotten a lot more interested in how films portray people who work in the more willing end of the profession. There are movies that kind of just go like, oh, stripper, sex worker automatically equals slutty and irresponsible. That is certainly not true. So I chose these two films because they're very interesting depictions. And again, I really recommend checking out Working Girls. And I understand that for both these films, they may not be the most comfortable movies to watch with other people, but I think they're both really worth watching for different reasons. Working Girls, this is a quote from Lizzie Borden when she talked about her conception for this film. Quote, in Working Girls, I basically ask, what is worse, 40 hours a week at some boring office job or 8 hours in a brothel? It depends on what you can handle. Some people can't deal with it, but is renting your body for 8 hours really worse than renting your mind for 40 hours by, say, working at Kinko's? And when you watch this, watch Working Girls, it follows Molly, who is, she works as a prostitute. She is a lesbian, and she said, she says that she takes this job because she knows she can't really form attachment to any of her male clients. Her wife or female partner doesn't know what she's doing. She always just says, well, I'm going to work. And it's an upscale brothel. She and her fellow coworkers, it's a nicely decorated place. They sit on couches. They get to go into private rooms. It's clean. Um, but there's a lot of minutia in what they do. There's a whole standard for it's like, well, you have to make the guest comfortable before you take the money, i.e., make sure they're disrobed so you can make sure they're not cops before you take the money. There's this whole thing of some of them want small talk, some of them have demands, but the way it's handled is not in a very sensationalized way. It is this idea of like well, this almost the same way a waitress would come in and go like, oh, table three wants another thing. And what I find really interesting about that movie. And the other thing I find really interesting about Working Girls is you have conversations with Molly and her various coworkers. One coworker she's talking to, like, oh, how's your boyfriend doing? And she says, oh, I kind of cut him loose because he said he had no problem with what I was doing. And frankly, if he didn't have a problem with it, that kind of made me uncomfortable. There was a younger coworker she has who's a college girl. She's doing this job because she's like, what, it pays well and I'm able to go to school. But she also doesn't tell her boyfriend what she's doing. She tells him she works in catering, but she actively says, well, it's safer here than when I'm in the street, than out in the streets. And that character has a confrontation with a client, and she actually tells him like, hey, you can't make me do anything I don't want to do in here. So this actually has a level of protection that another way of going about this work wouldn't have. Again, a fascinating film. I would really recommend watching it. Again, just wouldn't say watch it with your children. Probably wouldn't be a very comfortable viewing experience, but I think it's a fascinating film, and there are a lot of both critics and people who have worked in the sex work industry who laud this film for the fact that it's such a non-sensationalized portrayal of that work. The other movie I want to highlight is the 2020 film Zola, one of my favorite movies of that year, and I think one of the best movies of this decade so far. So if you are not familiar with the background of Zola, in 2015, there was a massive tweet thread of 148 tweets by a dancer named Asia King, who also goes by Zola. And it starts, I mean, pardon me for the language here, but if you've ever actually read those tweets, this is a masterclass in modern storytelling. It starts out with, do you want to hear a story about how me and this bitch here fell out? It's kind of long, but it's full of suspense. How is that for a storytelling hook? There are screenplays that don't start out that well. Um, but she details basically meeting this girl who is a fellow dancer, said, oh, we're going to go to Florida. I know a friend who danced there and she made like 8 grand in one night. Which, man, I was always taught when I was younger that if you stripped, you made next to no money. When I got older and realized how much money you could have made, I was like, wait a minute. I that, dang, you mean I didn't have to work temp jobs? Anyway, turns out her friend is very sketchy and involved in some let's just say not exactly legal activities. Zola's able to get her way out, but she decided to tell us all her story. Turned out some parts of the story were definitely exaggerated, but she does say the general thing of this girl taking me down to Florida, trying to have me do sex work with her, that did happen. Turns out that that girl and her boyfriend, not her boyfriend, but her the man who quote takes care of her, were arrested for human trafficking. um and again, you kind of wonder, how is this movie a funny movie? This is why I would recommend watching it. Number one, Zola is just a very funny storyteller, and that is worked into the screenplay. Also, there is the refuge in audacity. But one of the things about this film, there's a particular scene where Zola realizes Stefani is engaging in prostitution. And her response is not like a how dare you, not a, well, there is a how dare you, but not a what are you doing? You're so much better than this. She just says, no, no, this isn't for me. Have fun, be safe, use condoms. And of course, Stefani tries to give her a whole sob story. So she's just like, okay, fine. But when she finds out how little Stefani got for her job, she's like, oh, no, 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 we're fixing this. Makes a whole new ad for her and says, no, you have to charge more. Your labor, and she doesn't put it as your labor, she puts it as something else, but says, your labor for this is worth a whole lot more than just $150. And she goes over again some of the more mundane parts of sex work. There's lingo she goes over. When again, she's like, oh, I have a man who takes care of me. Zola's like, so if you're not familiar with that, takes care means basically a pimp. And there's even some stuff about like if you're in a strip club in certain places, you have to wear pasties because there's not permits. Again, these fascinating little details that in some more sensationalized films you don't necessarily get into. And again, I put there, always have an exit, which Zola talks about. She's like, yeah, you always need to know when to get out of here. But yet two films about the world's oldest profession, definitely more modern takes on it, but two that I would recommend. All right, and probably I would say the most referenced and famous film about labor on film. We're going to talk about Norma Ray, the iconic union scene, which Todd actually saw for the first time last week. And I hadn't seen until since high school. Which rewatching this film, if you have not seen this movie, or if you have, go Google the poster for this film. The fact that that is the poster for this movie is something that breaks my brain. I can't imagine. I cannot believe someone thought this is the best way to represent this film, which is, yes, it's a Hollywood movie, but it is not a very glamorous look at this kind of life. One of the things I appreciate about Norma Ray is the homes look dirty. The homes look old. The homes look dilapidated. This doesn't look like the new Hollywood version of poor. This looks like, oh, yeah, there are a lot of people here who are barely scraping by and living paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford to repaint their house. They can't afford to clean every day because they have to work. Anyway, if you have not seen Norma Ray, this is a story of a woman who, she is someone where she did not have the privileges that someone like I had. Her family worked in a textile mill. She worked in a textile mill, and she really never left her town and left the mill. Union organizer comes down. She decides to go to a meeting, and she decides that this is something she wants to put her mind to. And later in the film, she talks to her children and says, the reason I'm fighting for this is because if you go and work at the mill, I want you to have a chance at something better than I had. And that is why a lot of people who are in unions are in unions. So this was also based on a real woman, Crystal Lee Sutton, who she had a mixed reaction to this film. One of her biggest complaints was, it basically, she put it like, it put out there to the entire world that two of her children were illegitimate children, and that was not something she wanted broadcast. She also said the union organizer, the real life union organizer she had, was a guy who was from West Virginia. But movie made it into a New Yorker, and she's like, "Oh, that scene where we went swimming in the creek, yeah, that never happened." She's like, "If only we had had that much fun doing it." But she does say the main climactic scene of the film, the iconic scene where she stands up on the table with that union sign, and one by one the workers shut the machines off in solidarity, and then she gets arrested. She's like, "Nope, that's what happened." And she goes, "No notes on that one." And it's interesting because this movie, it's made in 1979, where unions were starting to be on the decline and organized labor. This was also right before the 1980s. And Todd, what year was the air traffic controller strike?
Let me double check on that one
Was
real
that
quick. One
80
sec.
or 80? I think it was probably 81 because it was during the Reagan presidency, and that didn't really technically start until 81.
81.
Okay, I was right. So in the 80s is where we start to really see the decline of organized labor. And you do have movies like what's the one with Michael Keaton, Gung Ho?
Yeah.
So yeah, there are movies about work. There are movies about the fear of, like, Gung Ho is about the fear of outsourcing. But in major Hollywood features, you really don't see a lot of movies about unions. Those tend to start to go into the more independent or smaller features. So you can look at Norma Ray as kind of I don't want to say a last gasp, but one of the last big Hollywood films to deal with the subject of labor organizing. So, kind of as I said, we're doing, films about union organizing were still made, but they were not the big screen Hollywood features. We look at 1984's The Killing Floors, directed by Bill Duke. So this is kind of sort of cheating. It did get a small theatrical release. It actually, I think, premiered either Venice or Cannes. But it was made for the PBS America's Playhouse, and it's the idea of a PBS America Playhouse film getting a theatrical release is not out of the ordinary. The prior year, there was the film Testament, which was also originally made for just television airing. The audience response to that was so powerful, they decided to give it a theatrical release. Jane Alexander ended up getting an Oscar nomination for it. So Killing Floor kind of went the same route. Bill Duke, oh, did Bill Duke pass, or is he still alive? But you
Still
can,
alive as far as I know.
yeah, I looked at a couple of interviews with him, and he credited the producer Elsa Rasbach, who also helped research and uncredited write the film. This film was written by Leslie Lee, who's a very accomplished writer, and it's about two Southern sharecroppers. They come up to Chicago during World War One because there's a lot of vacancies for work, and they're like, we're going to find work outside of sharecropping. So they get work in a meat packing plant, and again, they encounter racism because there's all sorts of different people there, but they also start to hear union talk. And the main character, he's really like, I think this is great. I want to join this. But his fellow Black workers are the ones that kind of see it as, don't get involved with that. They don't want us there. And then there's the extra layer of, we don't have the same security they do. If you join the union, it's a lot easier for them to fire you than any of the other workers. So, and this is something we see a bit in Norma Ray. We also see this in another film we're going to discuss. A common theme in these films is the companies using racial and other ethnic tensions to try to quash the unions. And sadly, in this film, it kind of works. But as Duke said, he wanted to make this film and other people in it as well to pay homage and tribute to the people who did try to build more interracial labor unions and a larger sense of solidarity between workers. And that leads us into Salt of the Earth. And I always called it Matawan. I think it's Matewan, but I'm just going to be a northerner and say Matawan. It just feels strange saying Matewan. I can't tell if it's an accent or not. But Salt of the Earth, if this movie sounds familiar, that's because I did discuss it during the Hollywood and the Red Scare program. So Herbert Bieberman was one of the people who was on that blacklist. So this was an independently made film. Michael Wilson and Paul Jericho, these were all people blacklisted during the Red Scare, and they wanted to make this movie. But this, and again, Hollywood at the time was like, I don't know, movies about labor organizing. Again, keep in mind that we actually see this in Matewan, that labor organizers were often seen as being pretty much right in line with communists. So that is a reason as to why that was seen as a little bit of a controversial topic. So both of these movies are based off real strikes. Salt of the Earth is based off of a New Mexico community. So in the movie, it's called, I think it's just called like, American Zinc. But in real life, there was a strike against Empire Zinc in 1951. And what makes this movie interesting, especially for 1954, and what we think about Hollywood or who Hollywood would focus on films, Mexican Americans are the protagonists of this film, and the husband, the miner, is not even the main character. It's his wife Esperanza. It's her trying to kind of help out in the union effort as well. And this is something that I think it's free on either Tubi or Pluto TV right now. So again, on one hand, I have very not so great feelings about streaming. On the other hand, the fact that a lot of older films and films that don't necessarily have copyright anymore are readily available, I think is fantastic. Um, and then we have Matewan slash Matawan, 87, directed by John Sayles. John Sayles, who should be in the discussion of great American filmmakers. He's never hit the heights of a Scorsese or a Spielberg, because he's always been a very independent filmmaker. Not that those directors aren't people who have their own line, but their own minds, their own visions. But Sayles has always been someone who liked to do stuff on his own. And he also knows how to do stuff on a low budget. If you ever want to see what a good director can do with a low budget, go watch Sayles' movie Brother from Another Planet. Um, but in Sayles is also, if you watch his films, he is also an incredibly socially and politically conscious person, which again, Hollywood, especially from like the 80s on, shied away from that a lot more. So this film is based on an actual 1920 strike in West Virginia, and Chris Cooper plays an IWW organizer who comes to help unionize local miners. So the local miners are already like, we're a union, we are going to go on strike. So the mining company decides to bring in Italian immigrant workers and Black workers, again, to try to inflame tensions. But turns out the Chris Cooper's character is like, no, we have to unite with all of these people. There's a scene early in the film where a character called Few, played by James Earl Jones, R.I.P. As I was saying earlier, I'm like, oh no, I hope I didn't do this by watching this movie last night. I had to rewatch it, but I was like, oh no, did I do this? But he comes in and says, like, I'm interested in the union as well. And he's initially rejected by the other miners as a scab. And he actually takes more offense to being called a scab than he does a slur. And Chris Cooper's character is the one who says, no, we've got to bring these people in. Even if they were brought in to be scabs, if they want to join the union, we need them for solidarity. And he has a great line where he's like, there's people that work and there's people that don't. And that's a phrase you hear a lot from people. But usually when they say that, the people that don't work, they're usually referring to this image of a poor person. But when Chris Cooper says there's people that don't, he's referring to the bosses of the mining company versus the people that work who are the miners. So again, a great film. It's like The Killing Floor, it doesn't have the happiest of endings, and which is true. A lot of labor battles in history don't have the rosy, victorious ending. I would actually recommend a really good book called A History of American 10 Strikes. It goes into stories like that. But it is also, it's number one, just a great American film, but like The Killing Floor, and Norma Ray kind of touches on it as well, it's a good look at what companies used to do to try to inflame tensions to prevent the workers from having a real sense of solidarity. So we're going from the blue collar working class work to white collar. One very Hollywood film, Working Girl, and another which is a Hollywood production, but de-glam to the point where I'm not like they didn't really know how to market Office Space when it came out, but we'll get there. So if you have never seen Working Girl, it is a delightful film directed by Mike Nichols. I'm actually, full disclosure, Melanie Griffith is going to be the guest at Camp John Waters this year, so I'm hyped. That is about Tess McGill. She's a working class girl. She's from Staten Island. She has to take the ferry over every day. She wants to climb the corporate ladder. She doesn't just want to be a secretary, but it's that age-old story of like, oh darn, I could make it if I was just given a chance. And she actually does. She thinks she gets the chance from her boss, Sigourney Weaver. Turns out Sigourney Weaver tries to steal her idea. And because she's been getting very chummy with Harrison Ford, she eventually gets to prove, like, no, I'm the one who had the great idea. She gets her office at the end, and then you see her tell her assistant, like, hey, don't go get any coffee for me unless you're getting coffee for yourself. Shows like, okay, she's going to be a more fair boss. Um, Again, it is still a very Hollywood story. Mike Nichols knows how to bring a bit more authenticity to these stories, though. One of the things I appreciate about this movie is it does show that sexual harassment is very prevalent in this world. And even when she gets canned for just being like, no, I'm not doing that. All of her coworkers like, yeah, we know it's awful. It's not your fault. And also like later, there is also the sense of like, yeah, we know your boss is terrible. We just all can't do anything about it. But there is something where the movie is very ahead of its time with Sigourney Weaver's character, which is now people would look at her as kind of that toxic girl boss archetype, but those words really didn't exist then. But the toxic girl boss archetype is the idea of this woman who is like, oh no, I'm good to every woman. I want everyone to succeed. I'm here to mentor you. Only that's not true at all. She's here to use your ideas. She's here to drive you into the ground, and she's here to take credit for all of your work. So, Working Girl, in many ways, ahead of its time. Office Space is a corporate culture, and I have worked corporate with my library degree. I gotta tell you, Office Space is far more accurate in terms, or I guess far truer to the corporate culture I have worked in than Working Girl. And that might just be because I worked in like a small office in Connecticut versus New York City. But a lot Office Space is a film that did not do well at the box office when it came out, written and directed by Mike Judge, who at the time was mainly known for Beavis and Butthead and King of the Hill, which was just starting to kind of reach its popularity on the Fox network. So some background, Mike Judge used to work in Silicon Valley. He worked in offices, and this was the 90s when the image of the computer people and these tech companies and Silicon Valley were these people are geniuses, these people are brains, they're the smartest people in the room, we should listen to them all the time. You see it a little bit here, and if you've ever watched Mike Judge's series Silicon Valley, you definitely see it there. Mike Judge does not buy into that at all. Mike Judge sees these tech people as like, oh no, they're just as clueless as the rest of us. Todd, would you agree?
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty accurate assessments.
Yeah.
And again, it's not even just like it's just the bosses. Even like some of the lower people are kind of framed as is vacuous the polite word?
It's vacuous. It's very, I'm just coming in here to get a paycheck. But you do see a couple of them have like a somewhat inflated sense of self. That idea of like, I do very important things here. Like, the Michael Bolton's character, yes, that's his name. There's a whole funny aside about that, but he does kind of have like I do way more important work here than some of the people they kept. That idea of like, no, to these people, they don't care what you do. They don't look at that. And then you have Peter, who's God, why am I blank? Can you
Ron Livingston.
thank you? It's like I know it's I almost said Rob Liefeld. And I'm like, nope, he's a comic book artist. Cannot do that. Yeah, Ron Livingston's character, he has an epiphany where he is like, oh no, I'm wasting my life in this cubicle. I'm not doing anything important, which again, kind of poking holes in that idea of the tech companies are these beautiful world changing companies full of geniuses. So he just decides, I'm going to do nothing at my job, and he gets rewarded for it. Um, it is a great little film just about how dull office culture can be. And also there with a side character, there is a whole thread about what some companies will do to avoid actually outright firing a person. They don't want to outright fire a person because guess what you'd have to do? Pay unemployment and severance. So they try to basically bully people into leaving. They have that with one person. There was also a great scene where they beat a computer with bats in a field, and let's just say, as someone who works with a really ornery and temperamental coin machine, I relate. All right. So we're going back to the 80s with Silkwood. A film that is probably more overshadowed due to the fact that number one, it's a biopic about a woman whose death is still debated to this day as to whether or not was this just a car accident or was this woman run off the road intentionally. And that is Karen Silkwood. She worked at a plutonium plant and she was blowing the whistle on really unsafe working conditions. And when she was on her way to meet somebody with documentation that supposedly proved what was going on, she had a car accident and those documents were gone. But what's interesting again about this movie for me, also, hey, directed by Mike Nichols again, he is some, like as I put it, he knows how to bring an authenticity to these stories that would otherwise, I think, be a little too Hollywood. There is a lot of focus on just what's the day-to-day grind at work? What is the process of coming to work? What is the process of getting ready? What's it like to work in this plant? Nichols and Nora Ephron do put a lot of work in, put a lot of that into the screenplay because, number one, because that helps with the dramatic tension of the story. You can't really be invested in the safety regulations of the plant if you don't know, if you don't even see your work there. Um, but it shows you that like this is a grind, especially I wonder what people who grew up with like the early ages of The Simpsons, who just think, oh, working in a nuclear power plant probably isn't that bad, would think if they went back and watched this movie. They're like, oh no, it's extremely dangerous. You could get sick. And of course, there's the reason the term Silkwood shower is thrown around as a very uncomfortable, high pressure shower situation. Um, it's something where I appreciate it more now than when I initially watched the movie when I was younger. And again, there's also a lot there's stuff in there about union organizing as well, and that's one of the reasons she kind of fights so hard for these safety regulations is because of that. So I would say recommend going back to this movie with a fresh set of eyes and look at it from a work story as opposed to just a biopic. All right, so we're getting to something a little more recent. I would say this is probably one of the best movies you have not heard of. Um, and if you've never heard of Ken Loach, I would absolutely say look up his stuff. Ken Loach is a British director who been working for decades, and he has always been incredibly dedicated to telling stories of people who are working class, people who live in poverty. Um, I was about to say I think he just made his last film, The Old Oak. He just kind of said, I'm getting too old to make films. But he's also talked in the past about other British filmmakers who started out making kitchen sink dramas, which were um that was the term for films that were about the lower classes and the working classes in Britain. But he said it was just a stepping stone. They eventually went to America. They eventually went to theater. They eventually went to making like highbrow dramas. Whereas Ken is like, no, I've stayed with these people for decades because he's just like, this is something, number one, that he finds fascinating, but he also sees it as these are important stories to tell because these are the people we live with every day. You are far more likely to know someone who is a gig driver for an Amazon company than you are, someone from, I don't know, the Love Actually movie. So this film is about a family, dad, wife, two kids. They want to own a home. They can't. This is, because in the wake of the big 2008 crisis, that wiped out a lot of what they had. So they're renting. The mother is a carer, so she goes to elderly people's homes to take care of them. And the husband decides to sign up for this Amazon style company. And he's like, they sell it on be your own boss. So he thinks I'll make money and turn my life around. He sells the family car so he can buy a van because, oh, if you work for this company, you either buy your own van to do your work with, or you have to rent a van from the company. And so then that leaves the mother without a car. She has to take public transportation. She's not home enough as more. It is an incredibly heartbreaking film that also shows you how predatory these companies can be and how much they will do to skirt any kind of um providing anything for their employees. Again, oh, you have to rent a car from us. So we live in the age of Lyft and Uber where people use their own cars, pay for their own gas, put wear on their tires and their car just so they can earn money, which is probably not enough from Uber. Well, Uber and Lyft make a lot of money. And again, Amazon, obviously, there have been a lot of exposes about what it's like to work at Amazon. And again, I say this as someone where I use Amazon for stuff, but you'll watch this movie, you might think twice about ordering something. It might be like, maybe I'll just go to a brick and mortar store. And I'm just gonna say this is one of the most heartbreaking endings I've seen in a movie in a while. I will not tell you how it ends, but let's just say the Hollywood version of this movie would end with this guy realizing this job is awful and leaving it. That is not what happens. And it essentially shows you how people can end up trapped in this cycle of having to work for these companies. I believe we have a copy here. I would highly recommend watching it. And again, it might, we had like, especially in the 2010s, all of these articles about like, oh, look how great the gig economy is. It allows people to make their own money, be their own boss. And this film, along with real life, has shown us that is not the case. And kind of blending into this is a little seen film until it got a release on the Criterion Collection called Takeout. It's directed by Sean Baker, who is one of my favorite filmmakers. If you have never, I should say, The Florida Project, Tangerine, Starlet, Red Rocket, all great films. He has another film coming out this year called Honora, which I've told people like I am ready for that to just be my favorite film of the year. because I love Sean Baker so much. And Sean Baker is someone who I think understands the American underclass better than a lot of other filmmakers because he doesn't fetishize them. He doesn't see them as a joke. He also doesn't try to make them overly moral, like, oh, these people are just simpler and better than us. He just understands, like the rest of us, they are people trying to live. And I think the Florida Project is a great example of that. I don't know if any of you are in Justice Film Group, but actually, Todd, would you like to explain what the Florida Project is about so I can get water?
Certainly.
Mhm.
So the Florida Project basically it focuses specifically on a single mother and her daughter who are they have basically set up in like a kind of it's almost like a little bit of Motel 6 type of situation.
More like an Econo Lodge or a Red Roof fan.
Fair. And yeah, basically it's this is where they have to live because they can't afford an actual proper home. And they're not the only ones like this. There are a lot of people where it is just economic situation being what it is, this is where they have to live in order to get by.
Yeah, they
And
can't. Yeah,
there's because of the Florida location, there's also this stark contrast of the fact that this is immediately next to Disney World, so you have this very haves and haves nots dynamic all throughout the movie.
yeah. And in the film Red Rocket, the main character, speaking of sex work, he tries to get a job after 20 years in the adult entertainment industry. And every time he tells people where he works, they kind of look at him like, ew, no. Granted, you shouldn't hire the character from Red Rocket for a whole host of other reasons, and the film shows you that. But Baker has said, he's like, oh no, I know people who they're like, oh, what did you do for this time? Oh, I stripped, or oh, I worked in the adult industry, and people will just go, oh, we don't want to work with you. But character here does not have a very highly sensationalized job. He is a delivery driver. He works for a Chinese restaurant in New York City. And he's smuggled into the United States, so he's an undocumented citizen or an undocumented person, I should say. He's in debt. He needs $800 to pay back loan sharks, or else it's going to be, what was it, doubled if he doesn't get it back to them in time.
I want to say yes, but I'm going off memory here, so I could
Yeah.
be wrong.
And also this was released in 2004 and I think made in 2002. So that's $800 in 2002 money. That's even more. So none of these people are the people in this film are made or professional actors. Some of them are undocumented. They are in the situation of the main character. And if you watch the film carefully, you will see, oh, there's a lot of people who we don't see their faces. We only see them preparing food or doing stuff from like the shoulders down. But kind of like our Amazon drivers, kind of like, again, janitors, we don't think about the people who deliver our food. We only see them when they come to our door, we get the food and we hand them the money. This is a film that shows you what is that guy's day like? And it's full of torrential downpours. He has to dodge cars. He has to deal with, people not wanting to pay him, people trying to stiff him. He encounters people who rob him and take his money. And that is not something I think any of us think about when we get our food from Grubhub. So once again, if you'd ever like to think about the person who is delivering your food, it's like this is a good film to watch because it shows you that job is just as hard as a lot of other jobs, if not harder. Just a reminder, when we think of dangerous jobs, we usually would think like, oh, police, firefighters. I know police is not on the list of the 10 deadliest jobs. I think the two technically deadliest jobs are loggers and I think it's fishermen, but delivery drivers are also on that list. There's a lot of people who get hit in accidents. They can get assaulted. It is a job that we never think of as being very fraught, but it certainly is. Just, reality shows us that is the case. But if you'd like to see a cinematic version of that, Takeout is a great example. So we're going to Sorry to Bother You, which might be the weirdest film I recommend here because let me tell you, the third act takes a turn. But kind of going back to corporate culture here, it's an interesting look at being in corporate culture, specifically being in corporate culture as a Black person. This is directed by Boots Riley, who's a Black man. So the main character is Lakeith Stanfield's Cash Green. He's a telemarketer. He's kind of an aimless guy, but he needs a job. He wants to move out of his uncle's garage, gets a telemarketer, and he starts to climb up the corporate ladder. There's stuff it discuss, which is you might have heard the term before, code switching. They talk about that, only they specifically make it as using your white voice over the phone, and each character in this film has a white actor voicing their white voice. So it is very funny. This is first and foremost a comedy. But two things that stick out again, labor and union organizing comes back into play. And again, companies want to try to break up the idea of solidarity. So they start to go like, well, if you don't unionize, we'll offer you more money or we'll offer you a bigger position. The other thing where this film really stuck with me at the time, and I think now, 6 years later, we can really look at it as very prescient, is the idea of this hip Silicon Valley CEO. So, Army Hammer, remember him? Actually, Todd, would we say this is unintentionally great casting?
I mean, people have kind of looked back on of the roles he's played. This is kind of the ones that you can most safely go back to after the allegations.
Well, it's yeah, because you look at it, you're like, oh, whoa, yeah, accidentally accurate. But he plays the CEO of this call center, and he kind of tries to pass it like, no, I'm hip, I'm cool. See, I like memes and I like all this weird stuff. I'm fun. I want to be your friend. And then as the film goes on, we see, oh no, he is just as tyrannical and villainous as we would expect, like the mustache twirling boss in, like Norma Ray. Um, it's a again, I don't want to give too much of the third act of this film away because man, does it go places. But it is one where it's again, let's just say there are certain CEOs of certain companies we might look at now and go, "Yep, this tracks." Moving on to, I'm going to say full disclosure, this is one of my favorite films about working I have ever seen, and that is Clerks. If you have ever worked a public facing job, which I have worked as a librarian. I have worked in retail. I have worked calls, not quite call center, but I've worked on phones before. There is something about clerks that truly gets some of the more aggravating aspects of public work. And I say this knowing that there is a lot of crazy stuff that happens in clerks that probably does not happen at everyday jobs. But again, the minutia, there that whole montage of annoying customer questions and obvious customer questions it's one where when I first saw this in high school, I'm like, oh, that can't be real. And then I worked jobs and I found nope, Kevin Smith was right on the money. So it's a day in the life of Dante. He's a convenience store employee. He wasn't even supposed to be here that day. He was covering for someone else, which, oh boy, this is another truism of working a public job. Hey, the person I'm covering said they were going to be in at noon. What do you mean they're not coming in today at all? What do you mean they're out for the next 3 days? No one told me this. That does happen as well. And Randall, a video store employee who does not care, I feel, and I have often said, I think had I been born 20 years earlier, I would have just run a video store, potentially like Randall sassing at my employee is sassing off at my customers, mainly because I owned the store and could do what I wanted. Or at least that would be my dream. Again, there's a lot of crazy stuff that happens in here, but as someone who's worked in public libraries for over a decade, we have crazy stuff happen in libraries too. When I was rewatching it, I rewatched this film not infrequently. I the scene where the Chuli's gum goes to just turn a whole bunch of people against Dante simply for being like, look, I'm gonna sell a guy cigarettes if he wants cigarettes. I'm not gonna moralize to him. I'm like, in the age of a lot of this like anti like book banning hysteria, something about this scene hits a little different now. There's that. I can attest though, no one at the DPL has ever closed the DPL to play hockey on the roof. I can promise you all that. There is a great line in there from Randall though, where it's like this job would be great if it weren't for the customers. I can't say I completely agree with that. Not so much at the library, but when I worked retail jobs, oh boy, did that line speak to me. And I think that's why this movie maintains its popularity with a lot of people, even though Kevin Smith's output is not as seen as good anymore, because I think there are a lot of people where we have worked those dead end customer service jobs where we kind of know there's no way up the ladder, there's no way out unless we leave. And just that grudge, that day to day drudgery. This movie does capture that, and it captures it in a way where it's funny instead of depressing. All right, moving on to our final comparison slide. We're getting close to the end. We're going to look at social work through two films, Short Term 12 and Precious. Short Term 12 is, if you've heard of Destin Daniel Cretton, he's the guy who directed Shang-Chi. I think he is directing the next Spider-Man movie. He's kind of now in the whole Marvel circuit, but he made his debut making this nice little indie film starring Brie Larson and also Lakeith Stanfield, Remy Malik, Catherine. I'm blanking on her name. She's been in a lot of not Catherine. Is it Caitlin Devanue? Todd, you know who I'm talking about, right? She was the other girl
Uh,
in Booksmart.
oh, what was it? Caitlin Deaver, I think.
Thank you. I was like, okay, what's her name? It really is. If you look at this in 2013, you're like, oh wow, young Hollywood blowing up right here. Um, so Brie Larson plays Grace. She's a supervisor at a group home for teenagers. These are teens who parents cannot take care of them or they are not allowed to see their parents. Lakeith Stanfield is someone who's about to age out of the system. He has nowhere to go, which this not work, but this is a reality for a lot of foster care. If you don't have anybody by the time you're 18, it's like, well, what else do we do for you? Um, and Grace's character is someone who one of the reasons she works with these kids and feels a connection with certain kids is because she is a victim of childhood abuse as well. And Cretton actually worked at a 24-hour foster care facility, and this is where this came from. So, and he said, like, there are some people here who they know how to kind of put the mask on and help these kids. And then there are other people, but he goes, there's others where after a while you cannot help but kind of open your hearts up to them. And sadly, you can get your heart broken in many ways because sometimes these kids do go back to the families or they just leave and you formed a bond with them. But I feel like social work is a very misunderstood position, especially people who have to work with like child services and keeping kids safe. A lot of times they're painted as the enemy, or they're not, or in some cases, either they're taking your kids away or, oh, they didn't do enough to protect the kids. But this is a film that shows that, and sometimes they're in a very weird, even legal situation of how much can we do. Um, and the other is Lee Daniels' Precious, which I would say a film very sensational. Um, if you have not seen it, it's not a bad film, but it's one where I think when I saw it 15 years ago and now I definitely see a lot more melodrama in it. I wouldn't say it's like a gritty, realistic story in some ways. But it is about a 15-year-old girl named Precious. She has been repeatedly abused by her father. She's abused by her mother. She has been impregnated by her father. She's pregnant for a second time. Um, just, really not a happy movie. However, there are multiple people who do like hard, not just social work, but these jobs, teaching kids who are trying to get their GED, people who work at hospitals, people like again, nursing assistants who are trying to help her kind of change her situation and help her out. Again, people we don't think of, these are people we probably don't think about because we don't see them every day. And this includes social workers. So there is a social worker who visits the home, and she is kind of, you'd see the archetype of the ineffective social worker because her mom, Monique, puts on a nice wig and puts on a nicer act for her. She brings her first daughter over, which the first daughter is being cared for by the grandmother in order to get the welfare check, the stereotype that we have seen before. But there is another character, Miss Wise, played by Mariah Carey, by the way. I remember when I first saw the movie, I'm like, why does this woman look familiar? And then seeing the credits, and I'm like, Mariah? Wow. She's actually good in the movie. I got to give her credit for that. And her character is fairly no nonsense. She kind of has that whole look, you got to talk to me if you want to get your check. But you also see throughout the film, because she's a more reoccurring presence, that she has empathy for Precious and she does want to help her, but it is also this thing of at the end of the day, there's only so much she can do. And so I kind of did some digging to see what social workers thought about the character in the movie. And some people kind of felt they're like, well, it's inaccurate. In many cases, she wouldn't have to talk to a social worker to get a welfare check. She would have to talk to a social worker for other things, or she'd have to talk to different people. But one of the reoccurring things I found was social workers said her attitude, her look, that just exhausted air she gives off is 100% what we have because we're not dealing with just one case. We are often dealing with an enormous caseload. And these are all horrible, awful, overwhelming stories. So that idea of you do care, but there is only so much you can do. And at the end of the film, she hears Precious's mother try to justify her abuse and she just gets up and walks away. She's just like, I can not handle this right now. And there were some people who said like incredibly unprofessional to do that, but there were others who were like, I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to get up after hearing a parent try to justify what they've done. So on to, I've mentioned this a couple of times, janitorial work. Probably the most recent film we're talking about, which is Perfect Days, which came out last year, a great film. And Ken Loach, once again, like Mike Nichols, he comes back. Bread and Roses is based on, kind of also based on a real labor movement and going back to undocumented workers. So Maya is a woman, an undocumented woman. She is in LA and she's doing janitorial work in a big LA skyscraper, which is, again, if you're in LA, this is not something pulled out of thin air. This happens every day. Again, these are the people who do a lot of this work that you can't see. And there's an effort to unionize the janitorial staff. Maya's like, yeah, I want to be a part of this. Her sister is scared. Again, we could get fired. We could lose. We could even get kicked out of the United States. We don't want to leave. So once again, and these are not painted as dumb concerns. They're painted as very legitimate concerns. And this is inspired by a real Justice for Janitors campaign by the Service Employees International Union. And what I find interesting about this and Perfect Days is janitors are people who are such an integral job in our society. Where would we be if we did not have clean public restrooms, or just if the library didn't have a janitor, if your local office didn't have a janitor? Um, with a lot of work, janitors, people who do plumbing work, people who just clean, these are people who keep cities running, but in many cases, they can't afford to live in the cities they work in. These are people who have to take like multiple buses. And if you like, we're talking about, let's say New York City, multiple buses and trains just to get to their job because they can't afford to live in Manhattan. Um, and these are unseen workers. And what's interesting is when the Justice for Janitors movement was happening, there were a lot of people like, oh, come on, that's not a hard job. And I'm like, you're cleaning public restrooms. Don't tell me that's not a job that isn't hard. My gosh, I don't even like cleaning my own restroom half the time. And so you contrast that with Perfect Days, which is, this came about when director Wim Wenders went to Tokyo and saw the Tokyo Toilet Project. Todd, would you like to explain the Tokyo Toilet Project a little more? Or do you want me to take that one?
I feel like you can probably handle a little bit more than I do because
Yeah.
I'll admit I have not looked into too much of the details on
Okay,
this.
so the Tokyo Toilet Project was, Japan has public restrooms, but it was this idea to have public restrooms that were a little, not quite upscale, but they're both restrooms and they're almost like art installations. So they're each one has a different architectural design around it. Some of them are, they look like they're transparent, but when they're occupied, there's a special like color that comes up on the walls where no one can see you. Some of them look like old caverns and pyramids. I looked into this a little more. It's a really cool just idea. And the main character is Hirayama. He is a cleaner for the toilets, and he is someone who takes pride in his job. And there's a quote here. Hirayama cleans these bathrooms not out of some narrow-minded sense of duty, but because he's part of an ecosystem in which cleanliness is understood as a collective good instead of the disgusting job of low-paid laborers. And again, he takes pride in it. He tells one of his coworkers, like, you should take pride in this. not just because it's your job, but it's like, hey, we probably use these too. We should have this place should be clean for everybody. We're doing this as a part of a public service. And honestly, as a librarian, I kind of related to that. This idea of this isn't the most glamorous job in the world, but we're doing this because we are part of a larger, the larger social contract. We're here to provide something for people. The other half of this film that doesn't focus on his job focuses on his day-to-day life, which is a life of simplicity. He goes to public baths. He goes and gets food. There's actually a nice detail of the place he goes to get like a drink. He often gets free drinks or some free food because they're like, hey, you clean our toilets. You do this great service. We're going to give you something on the house. He loves to go get new books and reads. He loves tape cassettes. He loves music. And for him, he's just like, a simple work is just what I want. And there is this implication we get through the film, about halfway through the film, that he comes from a wealthier family. And his sister sees him and says, oh, is it true you're cleaning toilets now? And he gives a look, which at first I thought was shame. But looking back, I kind of wonder if it's more just like, who are you to judge what I do? I am happy in the life that I live. And I think sometimes when we think about work, and I know that I've had this, I have friends that have had this, we kind of had this idea of, no, we should always be doing more. We should always want the higher, we want a salary to live, but we should always want the highest salary, the flashiest job. We want the flashy apartment, the flashy house, the flashy car. But then it's this idea of what's wrong with just having enough? What's wrong with having enough to to have some leisure activities, to pay your bills, to have a nice trip or two every year? What's wrong with enough? And I think Perfect Days is a film that not only encapsulates like, hey, janitors are people too, but also this idea of it is okay to want to simply work a job to give you enough, not to have you be, I don't know, a top G. So I know I've talked about Spotlight before. I have brought that up, but I like bringing this up mainly because a lot of other journalists point to this as one of the best depictions of actual investigative journalism. Um, so if you're not familiar with this, if I haven't talked about this before, this is about the behind the scenes work that the Spotlight team of the Boston Globe did to uncover the widespread and sexual abuse that was going on in the Catholic Church. And again, I was raised Catholic. I remember when that report dropped in Massachusetts, a pretty cataclysmic reaction from a lot of people, a lot of shock, a lot of anger, sadly, a lot of apathy. And some people trying to hand wing it, but this film is one that pays tributes to what they did. And I think when we think of a lot of investigative journalism, we think of it again being glamorous. It's like running to get that beat, running to get that one source, that down to the wire moment. Spotlight doesn't do that because that's not how it worked. It shows going to court, waiting to see what the judge is going to say, waiting for days at some point, having to go talk to people, and, not having it be this big fiery confrontation, but just there's a great scene where Rachel McAdams' character goes to interview an abusive priest, and the way he just says what he did is enough that I think a normal person would just either want to hit him or run away. But she's just there writing like, okay, okay, and keeping a poker face on because that is her job as a reporter. You're not supposed to really judge. You are supposed to just be like, okay, I'm just going to write this down and get permission to share it. As a librarian, one of the things I love about this movie is they go to the old Boston Globe News Library and they go through directories and they have to cross-reference this stuff. It's not this race against time. If anything, it's time consuming and they had to make sure they dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's. So if you haven't watched this movie, I'd highly recommend watching it. So we're going to finish off with the film Jean Dillmont. So we've talked a lot about jobs today, but these are the jobs where you get paid. But there's also this whole other, a lot of people like economic theorists have talked about. There's unpaid labor, domestic labor, then there's whole social reproduction theory. That's a whole, that all can relate to this, but I'm going to talk about domestic labor, which you're not, people who do domestic labor, people who do housework aren't paid unless they're a maid. But if my mom, she did housework in addition to her job. She never got paid extra for doing the laundry and preparing our lunches before she had to go to work. So Jean Dillmont is about a widowed mother. Her husband, it looks like he, passed away in was killed in World War II. She has some day-to-day activities. She writes to relatives. She does knitting. This is almost a 3.5 hour film. We see 3 days in her life and we see her routine. You would think this film would be boring, but I would say watch this film. It almost hypnotizes you because you get so into her routine and what she does. But nothing that she does is particularly exciting. She has to peel the potatoes to make mashed potatoes. She has to make a meatloaf. She has to go shopping. She has to go run shoes to the cobblers. But this is all stuff that has to be done in order to keep her household running because her son certainly isn't doing much. And it's just her. She can't afford a maid. If anything, she watches other people's kids, and we find out that she entertains men in her home. She engages in prostitution. We don't know why she does that. Does she do it for money? Does she do it for pleasure? Does she do it for a connection with an adult, any kind of human being outside of her son? We never learn that. But this film is something that, again, I don't know how many of us have ever really thought about all the work our moms did, or maybe grandparents, maybe fathers. Just usually, statistically, this work falls on the mothers. But it is, I would say, especially like if, my mom worked, but if you're older than me and your mother was a stay-at-home mother, or if you were lucky enough to have a maid, I would say watch this film because it might make you rethink everything they did and that kind of just all of these small little tasks that went into keeping the household going. I mean, hey, it was voted one of the best films ever made for a reason. Great film, an ending you will never forget, but I don't want to discuss that. And with that, does anyone have any questions? All right. Any questions or comments? Has anyone seen any of the films I've talked about? I figured Norma Ray would be the one everyone's seen. Nope, someone's typing something.
I've seen Working Girl, but I was thinking when you put the first one on, that was the one I saw, but it wasn't. I
Oh,
saw the other Working Girl.
yeah, no, a lot of people got that confused. Apparently in video stores, they're like, whoa, this is not the Melanie Griffith film. But Working Girls is a fascinating movie. And again, it is one that shows that it's not like, Molly's job is not easy. Because the women who work there, they do have to deal with clients who get nasty. They do have to deal with clients who can be threatening. But again, that goes back to them. They're like, oh, I'm a little bit safer here than I am if I was like on the streets. But there is even something where like the main character gets asked if she could pull a double shift. It's like, oh, someone couldn't come in tonight. Could you just do this one final thing? And she's like, I've been here all day. So it is taking that idea of like, what if you had to cover your coworker's shift in addition to your own, only putting it in a very different setting? Again, fascinating film. I understand why it might not be a comfortable watch for a lot of people, but I would definitely recommend seeing it.
By the way, just to
Yep.
double back on the earlier topic, I double checked. Yes, Max still has it up right now.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. So it is actually one I considered actually getting for the library, but I kind of figured I'm like, oh no, someone's going to see that and get mad. I'm not going to do that.
Especially if they think it's the other
Oh yeah.
one.
Oh no. Well, we do have the other one. We do have Working Girl. I made sure of that. But there's that, and if you haven't seen Perfect Days, we do have a copy of that here, and I think we have a copy of Sorry We Missed You. But I find the older I've gotten, and I think it's probably just because I've actually worked a lot more, I find the idea of work portrayed in film to be really interesting. There should be, I think, a better movie about library. There should be a good movie about just what it's like to work in a library, though. But I've just told people like it would have to be a show like Abbott Elementary or Parks and Recreation. It's probably closer to what we have. So we're gonna wrap up, but Todd, would you like to just give a quick pitch for next month's folk horror program? Because he is taking the reins for that one.
Okay.
Well, with any luck, the weather is going to continue to turn. It's going to start to feel like fall, which means it's the perfect time to go out into the woods and try to scare up something long forgotten and ancient. We're going to be going to the weird world of folk horror, which that's a bit of a broad topic. We'll get into that some more of the program, but it'll be looking at things like witches, curses, the heiresses,
Yeah.
cults, and all that's like and all stops ancient and forgotten therein.
So movies like Midsommar and The Wicker Man.
And the witch, for another
Oh,
example.
so I only know new folk horror. Todd's going to go into all the stuff from the 60s and 70s and Hammer films and whatnot.
Oh,
Indeed.
that sounds good.
All right. Well, we will see you all next month.
Right.
And
And thank you very much. I always enjoy your
oh,
programs.
thank you. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye bye now.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks.